Good morning. I stand in awe because I'm in the presence of a giant in my field. If I could achieve a fraction of what Professor Frank has done, I think I would have arrived. Let me introduce to you the keynote speaker for this morning, the first keynote speaker for this morning. Professor Frank Furtenberg is the Zellerbeck Family Professor of Sociology and Research Associate in the Population Studies Center at the University of Pennsylvania. He is also the current chair of the MacArthur Foundation Research Network on the transition to adulthood. If you look at Frank's CV, his work spans from the entire life cycle of emerging from youth to marriage to adulthood and then to the later stages of life cycle. His work he has published on teenage sexuality, moved on to reconstituted family. He's a giant in the field of the work on divorce. I think it is a tremendous privilege for us this morning to learn from him. Please welcome Frank.
Well, needless to say, it is an honor to be here. Let's see if I can be here. Can someone help me get the slide begin? And I would like to thank particularly Jean for putting together this wonderful array of ongoing research and scholarship in this region. I think as somewhat the token representative of the West, I will try to give you a picture, an overview, very quick overview of Western research. I trust you can hear me in the back well. And I will do this in a less than completely systematic talk that will range in topics. I give you a little bit of a preview of what I'm going to say. If this works, and it's my talk will build on a decade of research that a group that the MacArthur Foundation put together, a research network consisting of a dozen scholars from different disciplines who began to think through, beginning in the year 2000, what was happening, what has been happening to the passage from the teenage years to adulthood, what we loosely call transition to adulthood. This research is summarized in a volume that is actually available to all of you. We have copies in the back that have been sent from Princeton University that published the volume. It's I think, a very good summary of the state of research in the US particularly, a little bit broadly in the West, and some of the policy considerations that lie before us. I will talk about how changes in the transition to adulthood are reshaping intergenerational ties and family patterns, but that will be a piece of a larger picture that I'm going to try to weave together in using data from Europe. And I must say the data, this is a relatively new area in sociological and demographic research. In the 1960s, I wrote a historical article on the changes from the post-war period to about, well, it was really 1970s, to the point of 1970, saying that the contraction of early adulthood that had occurred in the post-war period was really quite remarkable. And the last paragraph of that article that I wrote with John Modell, a historian, indicates that it's quite possible that this pattern of swift passage to adulthood, which I will show you in a moment, that occurred in the post-war period might be coming to an end. Indeed it did, and more rapidly and with more profound consequences than I could foresee. We'll use data illustratively, not analytically, and the question posed for this conference is whether, under what circumstances and how changes in the West might apply to East Asia and Southeast Asia and beyond. And then I will touch upon some of the policy issues that are plaguing Western society, and I foresee will produce challenges, policy challenges here in Asia. I mentioned already that we have a copy of this volume in the back, and I think we have almost enough for all of you, but if we don't, we will make sure that anyone who wants a copy will get one. So what is the transition to adulthood? What are we talking about? I think we in this room, demographers and sociologists with a scattering perhaps of other fields, talk about the transition to adulthood as a series, a sequence of demographic events. And those demographic events, as I will note in a moment, were put together in a particular package in the post-war period that made it appear as if there was a highly ordered and highly organized passage to adulthood from the adolescent years, from the teenage years, and sometimes beginning in the late teens and really concluding by the early 20s. It was a very swift passage. And the statuses involved in the West, home leaving, which of course is different here in this region of the world, completion of education, not necessarily in that order, but about the same time, movement into full-time employment and economic self-sufficiency, often in the post-war period, or early post-war period, largely for men, and then family formation and in short order. And marriage was the main spring of this transition. It usually, all of the events occurred around the same, very swiftly around the same time. Now there are also a growing amount of evidence on the normative findings about the transition, and from the surveys that our network undertook, we see something. We did a survey in 2003 about what Americans thought were the important and necessary transitions in the beginning of the 21st century. And we were somewhat surprised to find that they really clustered in two ways. Everyone thought home leaving and early entrance to the labor force, completion of education, entrance to the labor force, were necessary transitions and to be an adult. But we found a substantial minority saying that marriage and parenthood were not. About a quarter of Americans said that's not part of the passage to adulthood. It may come, it may not, but it's not a necessary part. And there were particular class differences in the time of adulthood. So the more advantaged Americans had defined adulthood as the expected ages of adulthood occurring later, and as might be predicted. But there was some consensus among older Americans as well as young adults that this was, the ages were becoming later than they had been in the post-war period. And then we have also done a series of studies on the subjective changes that both precede and occur during the adult transitions. This is an area of research where I think we badly need more data. The way that young adults construct early adulthood, and we have a volume coming out later this year that will describe the results of some 500 interviews, qualitative interviews, where young adults talked about the meaning of adulthood in their eyes, and their lives and their family lives. So we've done a fair amount of research on this topic, but I think we've just touched the surface. And I think the European research on this is pretty non-existent. So how do people get a sense of feeling of social incorporation, of the sense of responsibility, which is so highly valued in Asian cultures, and their own emergent identity, which is so highly valued in Western cultures? And now I think that idea of a personal identity is spreading to this region of the world. Well, as I've already indicated, the transition to adulthood in the final third of the 20th century and the early part, the first decade of this century, has become more protracted. It is less homogeneous in the sense that the sequence and the order of the sequence is less shared by the population. In 1957, the median age of marriage was 20, and in those years, in the late 50s and early 60s in the US, 96% of women were married, and nearly as high a percentage had children. I will talk later a little bit about the growing differentiation within the population. The transition was less differentiated by gender, at least to the point of marriage and parenthood. Thereafter, it was extremely differentiated. And as I said, there are sort of two phases of early adulthood now. An economic transition that may occur in Western society somewhere in the early to mid-20s, and a family transition that is occurring somewhat later, particularly among privileged youth, in the mid to late 20s or even in the early 30s, and sometimes beyond that. So here I show a picture of the differences, and we are currently updating this. I've looked at the data I didn't just before I came here, and didn't have couldn't quite put it together to make a chart to update this to 2010, but the pattern of change persists from 2000 to 2010. So what you see here in these columns are males in 1960s, and the percentage at the top is how many have completed all of these transitions by age 30, by age 25, and by age 20. And then by comparison, by 2010. And you can see really quite a dramatic decline. For females, it is no less evident and no less dramatic. So 29% of all females by age 20, had gone through the entire, this entire sequence compared to 6%, and it will be lower in 2010. So this gives you some sense of how rapid this change has been. And in the next slides, I can't reproduce this for European countries, but I'll show you a sequence of data to suggest that this is happening everywhere. Education, what the factor that I think is most driving this change, education and delayed entry into the labor force, higher education is occurring in all European countries, and no doubt if we produce this for Asia, it would be very similar. The crude marriage rate, which it really gives you some idea of how many and how rapidly people are marrying, is the age of marriage is going up everywhere, and a decline in marriage. And as I said, you probably can't see these figures too well, and I apologize, but this is the mean age of childbearing, and everywhere, this shows just in the last 10 years, it has risen almost universally. And finally, not finally, but the number of people in consensual unions, not evenly distributed, a lot of variation among European countries and North America and Anglo-speaking countries, but consensual unions becoming a larger and larger part, sometimes in the form of de facto marriages, sometimes in the form of temporary relationships that may or may not precede formal marriage. And finally, and almost invisibly, showing that non-marital childbearing, at least in the formal sense, growing everywhere and becoming, in the West, a substantial fraction of first births, if not all births. So what's been driving these changes? Well, I've already hinted at the fact that the demands in post-industrial societies for a greater human capital, and with it, of course, the rise of post-secondary education, and that education in Europe, in the US, and here in most of Asia has been growing rapidly and becoming more extended, so that in the college degree is not the final degree in more and more cases. Well, that has to drive to some extent the delay in early adulthood. And it's a difficult labor market for younger and unskilled workers, having enormous policy significance for those who get left behind in the educational sweepstakes of testing and achievement. A problem that I think is likely to grow, and I will say a little bit more about this. Normative changes having to do with the desire for exploration and identity formation that I alluded to earlier have accompanied these structural changes. These sorts of cultural changes that encourage young adults to not know who they are, until they explore, I think are independent to some extent, but very highly related to the uncertainty that the future provides. So the unfolding of adulthood is partly a psychological process and not just a negotiation of these demographic transitions. And changes in family formation have been central. I have done quite a bit of work on changing sexual practices in the US and a little bit in Europe. And the fact that as the ages of the demographic transitions and the need for longer and longer schooling have occurred, accompanied by that are changes in sexual practices and cohabitation as an option, as either a prelude to marriage or an alternative to marriage, have really only occurred in the US since 1970 in a visible way. Not to say that there weren't changes of this, that there weren't patterns of this sort beforehand, but they were socially invisible. Once they became visible, they quickly became adopted. And I suspect in some Asian countries this is going to occur and is occurring and will occur in varying degrees depending on the resistance, depending on the openness and the possibilities. And I think this is a fascinating topic for research, comparative research. Reliable methods of contraception and the availability of abortion, more so in some places than others, have made this, the link between sex and marriage has, in the West, has virtually been severed. Sex was a major driver for marriage in this period prior to 1970, and no longer provides that kind of impetus. The changing family circumstances themselves, I think, give rise to different patterns of family formation. We are seeing in the West some increase in young adults living with their parents for a longer period of time. I will say a little bit more about that in a minute. Smaller families, that's part of the picture that allows, to some extent, and perhaps is caused to some extent, by the delay in the timing of family formation, and the greater tolerance for non-marital childbearing. Now, I should say, in almost all countries, except the U.S. And to some extent Britain, the vast majority of non-marital childbearing is occurring among couples and in a consensual union, a cohabitational relationship, and not single parenthood to unattached single females. In the U.S. and Britain, there's something of a variation, and we can talk about that later. It's not central here. Okay, so these changes, as I've said, are nearly universal. They seem to stem from similar, and I say causes here in a broad sense. Yet there are, to be sure, marked cross-national differences in the pace and packaging of the transition to early adulthood. These are related, as they will be in Asia, to historical and cultural differences. The European, Anglo-speaking countries are quite different and varied in their histories and culture, and they, as well as their economic structures, and those mediate the kinds of changes that have occurred, and we are only on the cusp of understanding how that works. And what we have produced some papers on this, but I think it's at the dawn of what is going to be a lively field of scholarship. Changing economic and social policies, of course, also mediate the differences and explain in large part some of the variations. But again, I would say we have very little systematic evidence on how, for example, the transition to adulthood is affected by different welfare state policies and different family policies. So to say that we know a great deal about this would be a gross exaggeration. I am sketching out what a field of scholarship that is ongoing, but as I said, at a very early stage. But I think, as here, and as the West provides, these variations provide an opportunity to understand how policies play out, how cultural and historical differences play out in the way that the transition to adulthood occurs in both the timing and how it's put together. These parts are not put together in exactly the same way as the data that I've shown suggests. Challenged institutions, I think, our network dealt very much with the fact that institutions are social institutions, with perhaps the exception of higher education for the privileged and the military, are very ill adapted to meet the needs of young adults. And I would go as far to say that even the labor market is ill-suited. The Germany, Austria, Switzerland, that have long had a tradition of connecting schools to labor market entrances, have in a vocational tradition, vocational arrangements have tried to tackle this problem, but to some extent the inability to know what future labor market needs are going to be makes this connection very difficult to achieve. And of course, youth-serving institutions are being challenged as the proportion of young adults now have needs that really didn't exist. And as I said, the university is the institution, particularly in the US, that is well tailored to and comprehensively tailored to serve the needs of young adults. But if we think of the bottom half of the population not going on to tertiary education, and particularly the bottom third, we have institutions like the criminal justice system, which is which actually mal-socializes young adults, children, adolescents, and young adults. There is a big gap between these institutions and where childhood ended at presumably 18, the age of dependency, the presumed age of the majority entering adulthood. These ages have no meaning anymore. 18, 21 simply do not describe the current experiences of young people to manage self-sufficiency in the US or Western Europe, and I dare say some of these issues are arising in Asia. I will talk now about the family a little bit more. The discourse in the media, and here I turn to the US, is about the Italianization of young adults, because Italy has been the model of a late home leaving, as if late home leaving were pathological. And we're beginning, and you know, this is the discourse, and we're beginning to change, I think, people's ideas about home leaving and the role of the family. But early autonomy was so valued, so very valued, that it is, I have been on countless talk shows where people say, what's wrong with these people? I left home at 18 and was, you know, fully self-sufficient by that time. Why can't people do it today? Are they becoming less capable and less autonomous? Well, they may be, because the institutions that would otherwise absorb them into the labor, particularly the labor market, are less hospitable and welcoming. It's not clear yet whether this is changing notions of psychological dependency on the family. And again, that's viewed to some extent as pathology in the West, as most of you know, rather than as a growing, changing, reciprocal relationship, as the provost alluded to in his very nice talk. How much does the timing of home departure depend on longer education, on the inability of the labor market, I think, to absorb people, and the delay of partnership formation? Well, I think a great deal. Again, we are just beginning to understand how the package is put together, and that's, there's a lot of evidence that there is a good deal of feedback and interplay between schooling, economic independence, and normative change. In fact, single youth are, until perhaps the recent recession of 2008 and 8, are no more likely to live with their parents than they ever were. It's just that there are many, many more people delaying the transition to a union. So, but again, I would say we know very little about the long-term effects of these later adult transitions. What will they be? How do they? One hint is that they are very much changing relations between young adults and their parents. The period of the 20s was a period of withdrawal in the West, often. Less so in the Mediterranean countries, to be sure, than the Nordic countries, and the US, and to some extent Canada, represented an extreme case of early autonomy. But we are learning a little bit more, but only a little bit as yet, about the daily routines of family life of young adults. There's a tremendous literature in the West on how adolescents relate to their parents, teenagers. There is almost no literature on how young adults relate to their parents, we're gradually filling in, or rather rapidly filling in this gap that suggests that parents and young adults are mutually learning to negotiate how to live together, how to maintain a certain level of autonomy and yet co-dependency. Young adults are learning how to reciprocate The flow of help has been largely downward, but young adults are learning how to manage and give back to their parents. But this is all a process of innovation and experimentation, and it would be hard to say that there are any normative standards for this. So people are beginning to write books about how to do this, not knowing much about how it's actually being done. And I would say here's an area where we can learn a great deal from Asia, to the extent that you can tell us about how these patterns are, these ongoing exchanges, and the patterns of, shall we say, intergenerational cohabitation are occurring. We have done a few qualitative studies, and I summarize them in a piece in that Future of Children volume, that parents are very much willing, and most parents understand the need that the parental contract is been changed, and they're in for a longer period of time. And they understand that their young adult children still need support, not just material support, but guidance, and how to enter the labor market, and because the labor market is not easy to enter, how to, not so much guidance about courtship and marriage, but that may be more relevant here in Asia, although I understand there's some resistance to parental advice in that realm. So I think our studies, or early studies, suggest that parents are particularly willing to help in the early 20s and begin to expect movement by the mid-20s. And so their support flows rather generously in the form of sometimes money, but sometimes bed and board, but it's based on accomplishment and need. Accomplishment on whether they see their young adult children making the transition successfully, committed, what you would say, I think, responsibility, and need on the basis of whether they have special needs or special problems. That's what the research is showing, so that parents extend extra help in times of unemployment, divorce, illness. But as I said, this is a topic where I think it's a very fruitful topic for comparative research. Now, let me map on to this pattern that I've been describing in most general terms, the fact that we are seeing vast differences in bisocial strata. There have always been differences, but they are growing. Everywhere, inequality is growing, and that maps on to the transition to adulthood. It makes a huge difference in the ability of parents to invest in this period, post-adolescent period, in the parents to help in the way of being able to provide guidance in the educational arena and the labor market, help in home leaving, and help in family formation. There's evidence that parents are being asked to help out more, and a study done sponsored by our research network and published in one of our volumes on the frontier of adulthood, that roughly 10% of parental income goes to children over age 18. These class differences, and that's across all classes, but of course, as I'll show you in a moment, it makes a huge difference which economic decile we're talking about. So that the class differences have widened, creating a gap between the privileged a gap between the privileged and middle-income people who are being stressed to provide the help to their children that they need, and that is an area where I am personally engaged in research. And of course, the wide number of disadvantaged youth. How am I doing on time? Am I okay? I still have, good. So these trends let me just show you in the West, but unfortunately I do not have these for, well, I have a little bit to say about a couple of Asian countries, but the inequality has virtually grown everywhere. The only exception is France. This slides that I'm showing you are to the middle of 2000 to the first decade of the 21st century. Probably if we were to update this, the changes would be universal, but as you can see from the mid 1980s to the mid 2000s, virtually everywhere inequality is growing. The U.S. is, again, an outlier in this pattern. We started out with high inequality, and it's grown even more. Income inequality, as you can, now we're looking at the actual level of income inequality, and you can see the variation, the enormous variation in OECD countries. And here, I believe, if I have to put my glasses on to tell, but there, you can see Japan and I think Korea, yes, situated. For those of you in the back, Japan is, there it is, and Korea. They are so above the average of the OECD in inequality. Well, I would like to situate all the countries represented here in this graph, but and also look at the change at the same time.
What date is this?
This date is, I think, 2005, if I'm not mistaken. Sorry. And it's showing the Gini coefficient, which is the measure of inequality, and it also shows the top decile to the bottom decile, another measure of inequality. So this is a significant figure, and it interacts with this transition to adulthood, change that I've been discussing in obvious ways that are probably best expressed by this paper that I've done with Cornish. He has done most of the work with the, so deserves most of the credit for this wonderful slide. This will appear in bibliography in the forthcoming issue. But, and, you know, the interesting thing is that all deciles, these are income deciles, and this is the bottom, these are cohorts that are represented in the distribution of spending for children. Now, I should say, at least just as a caution, this is from the Consumer Survey, Expenditure Survey, which is available in many countries, and we are now extending this research to look at different countries, but this is just the US, and it just deals with certain items, primarily child care and education is driving a lot of the changes. We show in this paper, just incidentally, that the expenditures for males and females are becoming more equal over these cohorts. But the interesting thing here is what is happening in the most recent cohort with the top 2 deciles, where they're fanning out in their expenditures, and it is not because they are spending more than the rest of the group. It's because they have more to spend. The percentage is actually constant, but they have much more to spend. And this is, as I say, being driven largely by childcare and educational type of investments. But it suggests that we're going to see, and I think we're already seeing, creating impossibly large differences between the bottom deciles and even the middle deciles compared to the top deciles. So that the rich are in some sense advantaging their children more than they did previously, and by their ability to invest in children. So let me now conclude with a final slide. Am I about at the point? Good. I think we need to think very hard about the renovation of institutions, or in some cases, the building of institutions. And I've already said that we need to think about the relationship of tertiary education now and the meaning of tertiary education, because everyone is not going to go to college or complete college. In the countries where there's high entrance to college, it's about, the university, it's about 50% enter. The rates of completion of university are vary tremendously from country to country. But everybody is not going to enter and complete university training. And if they did, we would further differentiate. We would really just prolong the process and further differentiate by post-tertiary education. There is already some indication of inflation of education in order to gain advantage. So labor market policies to absorb younger workers who are not college bound but may need technical training to fill the range of skilled jobs that do not necessarily call for a tertiary completion of a tertiary education or university degree. We need service experience for youth to bridge the gap to labor markets. We need transitional support for youth in the form of perhaps housing, and maybe less so in Asia than we do in the West, but families often in Europe are not prepared to have the co-residence of their children, and maybe in Asia youth are less willing to co-reside for lengthy periods of time prior to marriage. So we need transitional support. We need services, especially for the vulnerable populations. And in the U.S., we talk about the disadvantaged youth who may drop out of school, may have special mental health problems, may have limited family support. Those populations, which are evident in varying degrees in different countries throughout the West, no doubt will be evident in varying degrees throughout Asia. But I think we need to rethink the way that service systems work to provide a more seamless transition from services that were designed for children and adolescents to services that are designed for adults. We need to train people to understand the needs of this, the developmental needs of this young, early adulthood period. And we may need to reconsider the age eligibility for services, where often young people are cut off at a certain point. In the US, it's been 18 traditionally. And whether in the West, there's varying degrees of support, of economic support for university students, or for students who are unemployed and looking for work, or for training, or in training programs. We need to consider the possibility of service corps that might bridge the gap for this period. So it's a time of great change, and finally let me say in conclusion that if these challenges are not met, I believe that this will have real consequences, not only for the ability of the next generation to support the elderly population, but for their willingness to have children themselves and form marriages themselves. Because if they don't see the possibility of being able to invest, if they're still investing in themselves and trying to find themselves, they cannot, they're not going to be prepared to make the transition to investing in a new generation. Thank you very much.